and welcome to 3Q, where I interview industry professionals for just 15 minutes by asking three powerful questions. I'm your host, Rachel Vogel, and joining me on tonight's episode is David Israelite, the president and CEO of the National Music Publishers Association. David has held his position with the NMPA since February 2005. He's responsible for overseeing all aspects of the company's operations, from legal strategy and implementation to government affairs and advocacy. His leadership has produced revolutionary successes on behalf of publishers, including the largest CRB rate increase in history, groundbreaking industry collaboration and royalty rate agreements, landmark settlements and model licenses with streaming platforms, and ultimately raising the profile of the publishing community. He was instrumental in guiding the effort to modernize copyright laws, culminating in the Music Modernization Act and the subsequent creation of the Mechanical Licensing Collective. He's been named to Billboard's Power 100 list multiple times and serves as the president of the NMPA S.O.N.G.S Foundation, supporting our next generation of songwriters, which supports songwriters through funding, scholarships, and direct services, among other assistance. So, David, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have you on the podcast. Are you ready to get started?
Thank you so much. I am.
Let's do it. Imagine for a second you're sitting down with your 25-year-old self. What one piece of advice would you give him on a personal note? And what one piece of advice would you give him from a business perspective?
So when I was 25 years old, I was a young attorney at a big law firm in Kansas City, Missouri, where I'm from. I think that the advice I would give my 25-year-old self is figure out how to learn how to win while letting other people win too. I think prior to that time when I was 25, most of my formative years were spent in very competitive exercises where I looked at the world as winners and losers, whether that came from sports, from debate, from law school. And I always felt like I wanted to win, but that necessarily meant someone else having to lose. And I think that as I've gotten older, and in particular in this job in the music industry, it's a very valuable lesson to figure out how to create win-win situations. And that's not something that I think my 25-year-old self was very good at.
That's fair. I think a lot of people probably look back and would say the same thing. Before we dive into the next question, so as you mentioned, your early career wasn't as focused on the music industry. So I'm curious, what led you to venture into the music business? And looking back, do you feel as though it's something that you were always kind of meant to do?
So I grew up loving music. I was a very bad guitar player that wished that I had been a good guitar player and could have made it as a musician, but that wasn't in the cards. And so for my professional life, it was very much focused on law, government, and politics. And I had absolutely no idea that I would ever end up in the music industry. And so I had a career spent as an attorney, as someone who worked in Washington, D.C. For senators, who ran campaigns, worked on a presidential campaign. And I found myself then at the Justice Department working for the Attorney General of the United States. And while I was at the Justice Department, this was during the period of time when Napster was a serious problem for the music industry. And one of my best friends just so happened to be running the RIAA, the trade association that represents the major record labels. And I was seeing through his eyes the challenges that artists and record labels were facing in this period of time where most people just stole their music. And so I went to the Attorney General and asked whether we could create a task force on intellectual property. And he was kind enough to do that and let me chair it. And so for a couple of years, in addition to my day job working for the Attorney General, I ran this task force where I dove very deeply into the issues impacting copyright, how to protect it, and what was going on. And the music industry was being impacted probably more than any other industry. And so when I was ready to leave the Justice Department and not quite sure what I was going to do with my career, my assumption was it would be something more law, government, politics based. That's when I met NMPA looking for a new CEO. And through absolutely no planning or brilliance of my own, I luckily stumbled into this position, which was 20 years ago. And it just so happened to be the absolute perfect job for me, because it married an industry that I loved, which was songwriting and music, with what I actually did in my career, which was more law and Washington focused. And so it turned out to be the perfect blend. And I got here by accident. But now looking back on it, I just feel very fortunate because I absolutely love what I do.
That's an incredible story. I feel like that's usually what happens with the best situations. You just stumble into it. Turns out to be the best thing. All right, next question. Every industry has its dirty little secrets, and we all know that's no different in the music industry. Sometimes people think that's a bad thing, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they could be quite good. So, what's one secret you would like to share with our listeners about the industry?
Well, I think some people in the industry have a sense of this, but I suspect that even people that work in music don't fully realize just how much market forces don't impact the value of songs. When songwriters create songs and music publishers represent them, most people assume that they're getting paid based on the value that they're creating. That's how most industries work. I'm a strong believer in capitalism. I'm a strong believer in market forces. And normally you would say, what's the value of these songs being created? And the people who create them would be compensated in line with the value that they're creating. I think what is still fairly a secret is that for almost the entire industry as a songwriter, you are not getting paid based on the value of what you create. So songwriters basically get paid in three general ways. One is when you sell copies of records, or today when people pay to stream. The second is when music is performed publicly over a public airwave, like through radio or television or in a bar or restaurant. And the third is when you marry the song with some type of video, whether it be a movie, a TV show, a commercial, or something more broadly like YouTube or Facebook or TikTok. Those are the three basic ways that songwriters make their money. For that first way that they make money, when people buy copies or they pay for a streaming service, the federal government sets the price. And that's been the case since 1909. That's not how recording artists and record labels work. They get to negotiate the value of what they create. But for songwriters, they have to license their copyright. It's a compulsory license under the law. And three judges set that price every 5 years. The result of that process is that I believe songwriters are getting significantly less than they should. When it comes to the second bucket, public performance, or when music is publicly transmitted, most of that is done through organizations that have been regulated by the Justice Department since 1941. We have these consent decrees that govern ASCAP and BMI, which are the largest companies that license, collect, and distribute the money from public performance. They also are getting significantly less than the value of these songs. And then finally, the third way, which we call synchronization, when you put video and music together, that's not regulated like the law regulates it or these consent decrees regulate it. But the way that the law works is it's very hard to keep your music off of these sites because of how the laws that govern internet sites and things like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act work. And as a result of that, the negotiation over the value also is impacted by the way that it works. And so what's a dirty little secret is that songwriters are probably getting a small fraction of the value that they're actually creating. And I think people, even in the music industry, don't fully realize just how bad that is compared to the true value that they have.
I agree. I feel like everyone in the music industry definitely knows that it's an issue, but they don't know to what extent.
I think that's right.
So before we dive into the next question, you serve on the board of several music-related organizations like the Songwriters Hall of Fame and the Country Music Association, but you also serve on the board of the Special Olympics DC. I'm just curious, is that something that you've always been passionate about, and what led you to getting involved there?
So Special Olympics has always kind of held a special place in my heart for a long time. And so when I got to Washington, I first just reached out and started volunteering my time. It was a wonderful experience. It felt like it was giving back. And for some reason, watching these athletes, and that's what they are athletes, compete with the challenges they have was always inspirational to me. And so when I got in the position of running NMPA, that then became a favored charity of ours. And my entire team would volunteer our time. We would donate money. And then eventually I was asked to serve on that board. And it was a very rewarding experience. I really got more out of it for me than I gave back. And it's just something that I recommend that anyone in your local community check out and get involved in with helping these very special athletes.
That's incredible. All right, next question. Throughout your career, I can only imagine you've been asked plenty of questions, whether it was for industry conferences, the media, or perhaps a promotion. But throughout all of those interviews and all of those questions, there has to be one that you've never been asked but would have liked to. So, what is that question and what would be your answer?
I can think of a lot of questions that I've never been asked that I think would be interesting, but this kind of ties to the earlier question. And that is, no one's ever asked me, well, you have these very strongly held views about how songs have been undervalued with the way that we set prices, whether it's through the mechanical reproduction law, the consent decrees over ASCAP and BMI, or the way that internet companies use music where they don't feel the same need to negotiate its price like they would for other products. No one's ever asked me, well, then what do you think the real value is of what songwriters do? And I have an opinion about that. We know that last year in the United States, songwriting and music publishing generated just over $6.2 billion. The question is, what is the real value of what these songwriters are creating? And if I had to put an estimate on it, and I've done quite a bit of thinking about what would happen if we licensed our property the way that other industries get to set their prices, where the people using the property have to agree on a price or they just can't use it. And think of almost any other industry in the United States where someone creates something, whether it's a physical good or intellectual property, but you can't access it or use it without a price that you've agreed upon. And the person setting the price obviously wants to get the most they can, but they have to price it at a place where people will actually pay that price. It's a market force. I think the answer is somewhere in the neighborhood of around $25 billion. I think it's worth probably more than 4 times what people are paying for it. And I'll just give you a couple of evidence points that suggest that. Right now, when a Spotify or an Apple or an Amazon want to use music in their streaming services, they negotiate with record labels and they litigate the price that they pay songwriters. Well, record labels are getting somewhere between 50 and 55% of the revenue created by these streaming companies like Spotify, Apple, and Amazon. Songwriters and publishers are getting about 15% of the revenue. I think that the two different inputs are equally valuable. I think that songs are just as valuable as the recordings of those songs. Then you look at public performance, where take broadcast radio. Broadcast radio pays nothing to recording artists and record labels, which is very wrong. But they only pay about 4% of their revenue for the music that they play. And so if you think about an AM/FM radio station that plays a lot of ads and they make money and their only real input is music, how are they only paying 4% of their total revenue for the product that they are then transmitting to their customers to make money off of? That seems ridiculously low. Then you look at the third bucket of synchronization, where you look at what we're getting paid from companies like a TikTok. And quite honestly, it's not close to the value that's provided. These services, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, they probably wouldn't exist without music being some part of what they do. And yes, they're not true music services, but the music is so important to what they do that if they actually had to negotiate its value, where if they didn't come to an agreement on a price, then they couldn't use the music, then I think that the number that they would pay would be significantly higher. So you put that all together, and what is the value of songs in this economy? I think it's at least 25 billion instead of the 6.2 billion that it was last year.
Wow. That's great information, and I would have to agree with you. I think it's worth a lot more money. Before we close out the episode, kind of touching on all the points that you just mentioned and things that you mentioned previously, the last couple of years, especially the last few months, have presented so many changes in the industry in terms of major labels, independent artists, streaming rights, and so many other sectors of the business. And we all know that the work is never finished. But with that said, what are your thoughts about the changes? And in your opinion, what work still needs to be done in the immediate future?
So it's a constantly changing industry, and that's just fine. And I think many people in the music industry have this false sense that they just wish things were different instead of focusing on how to make it work with the reality on the ground. And I think the music industry has learned quite a bit from the days of Napster to today. And what I see now is an industry much more willing to experiment into how to make things work and to try to work cooperatively with new technologies. But that being said, I think that there still are some really significant challenges. For songwriters, we live in a world today where the industry itself is very healthy. We've had double-digit growth for over 7 years in a row. But that doesn't mean that all songwriters are doing well. We now live in a world that is mostly comprised of listening to hit songs instead of buying full albums. Well, the impact of that is that the songwriters at the very top, they're doing quite well. But for the songwriters that are the working professional songwriters, kind of the middle class of songwriting, the economics for them are much, much worse because they're no longer getting consumed in the same way when people buy full albums, and the hit songwriter gets paid the same as the songwriter on the 12th track of that album. You also have such more fractionalization of the industry where there's a very long tail of more people making something from music because it's so easy to make the music, to distribute the music, to just put it up yourself on social media or the streaming platforms. So you've got more people making something. You've got the top writers making a lot, but the middle class is being squeezed. And that's why I'm so focused on the economics of what they're contributing, because again, they should be making 4 times what they're currently making. And that's the difference between a professional songwriter saying that they can do this as a job, or maybe having to quit or have to take another job outside of music. And that's something that we're struggling with, is that the industry revenue is growing, but some songwriters are being left behind. And look, let's be fair. Not everyone has the right to make a living writing songs. It's kind of like sports. There are only so many jobs you can have as a professional athlete. My point is not that everyone deserves to make a living from writing songs, but that if you are in that area of the very top, the people whose songs are being recorded and listened to, you deserve the value of what you're creating. And right now, for songwriters, that's just not the case. And so things that need to change include fixing the way that we price songs for streaming services, giving songwriters and publishers more leverage to be able to say no or only agree to the use of their music where it makes economic sense. And I think that we need artists and record labels to really help take up the cause, because quite honestly, almost all hit songs are written by a songwriter other than the recording artist. I think, more than 98% of the Billboard Top 100 have at least one songwriter who's not the recording artist. And so for labels and artists, they should care about keeping these professional songwriters around, because without good songs, you're not going to make good records.
And is there anything that the general public listening to these episodes and this interview specifically can do to help the cause?
It's a great question, and it's very hard to answer because, quite honestly, I think you're not going to have a lot of fans changing their behavior to help the anonymous songwriters behind the songs. But if you care about songwriters, then I would say pay attention and try to consume your music from companies that act ethically. Right now, Spotify, for example, is not an ethical company in how they treat songwriters. So maybe that's something that consumers should take into account when making their decisions. A lot of consumers believe that when they buy tickets to concerts, that's them supporting their favorite artist. And that's great for the recording artist. But that doesn't help the people who wrote the songs for their favorite artists. Those songwriters are not making money from those ticket sales. And so you've got to find other ways to support the writers behind the great songs. And so that's why I think it's important that if you're a fan, pay attention to these issues and try to, construct your behavior in a way that's supportive of the people that write the songs.
Well, it's about time we close out tonight's episode, but David, thanks again for joining me. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
To everyone listening, I hope you enjoyed tonight's episode. Stay tuned for next week of 3Q, where I interview industry professionals for just 15 minutes by asking 3 powerful questions. See you next time.